In 1600, Akbar the Great was 58 years old and the ruler of a magnificent empire. The Mughal Empire covered nearly half of India, most of Pakistan and Bangladesh, and even parts of Afghanistan. Akbar should have been enjoying the final years of his life and preparing to transfer power to the next generation. But in reality, Akbar was miserable. His attempts to expand into the Deccan had been stymied by Malik Ambar, a former African slave who was now the prime minister of the Ahmadnagar Sultanate. But more importantly, Akbar's family life was in turmoil. One of his 3 sons had already died of alcohol poisoning. The other 2 were well on their way because they were both alcoholics and addicted to opium. And Akbar's eldest son, Salim, was in open rebellion against him. In this episode, we're going to discuss this turmoil between Akbar and his son Prince Salim and the repercussions it would have for the Mughal Empire. Before we start discussing Salim's rebellion, let's recap the actions that Prince Salim had taken. In 1599, Akbar led an army down into the Deccan. He left his son, Prince Salim, behind in Agra with orders to march on Rajputana, located in west-central India. Salim initially seemed to obey his father, but he suddenly turned back around, went back to Agra, raided the treasury, and then occupied Allahabad. Once he was in Allahabad, he dismissed his father's officials and began minting coins in his own name. Now, it's not exactly clear why Salim chose to rebel against his father, and as we mentioned in the previous episode, this wasn't a true rebellion because he only occupied Allahabad and none of the critical cities like Delhi, Lahore, or Agra. However, we can't ignore the fact that he did strike coins in his name, which was a sign of rebellion. However, it is possible that this rebellion was due to the years of acrimony and hostility that had built up between father and son. And Salim may have been tired of waiting for his father to die, and he was likely also concerned that Akbar would appoint his grandson Khusrau, who was also Salim's son, as his successor instead of Prince Salim himself. Akbar learned about Prince Salim's rebellion while he was on campaign in the Deccan. Akbar paid the remaining holdouts in the Deccan for their vassalage, basically nominal acknowledgement of his rulership over them, and then headed back north to deal with his son. But instead of going straight to war with his son, Akbar sent his top advisor and one of his closest friends, Abul Fadl, to Allahabad to try to talk some sense into the prince. However, when Salim found out that Abul Fadl was on his way, he sent a man named Raja Bir Singh Dio to intercept him. Raja Bir Singh Dio was the warlord ruler of Orcha, which was about 190 miles east of Allahabad. Raja Bir Singh Dio's men ambushed Abul Fadl, dispersed his small entourage, then killed him and beheaded him. They sent Abul Fadl's head back to Prince Salim, unceremoniously threw it into the toilet. Akbar was furious to learn that his son, his own son, had killed one of his top advisors and one of his closest friends. But despite his anger, Akbar still refused to go to war against his son. Finally, it was the women of the family who intervened to try to calm things down. First, Akbar's aunt, Gulbadan, and his mother, Hamida Bano, talked him into forgiving his son Salim. The argument was basically that he had already lost one son with the death of Murad Mirza, and he didn't want to lose another one. So with that done, Akbar's wife, Salima Sultana Begum, went to Allahabad to try to talk some sense into her stepson, Prince Salim. Well, Salima Sultana Begum was successful, and in April 1603, Prince Salim arrived at Hamida Bano's house laden with presents for his father Akbar. Akbar accepted his son's apology and placed his turban on Salim's head, which was a sign that Prince Salim was still his successor. Now, even though they had reconciled, father and son still remained kind of distant. They rarely saw each other after this first meeting in Hamida Bano's house, and Salim wound up spending much of his time at Fatehpur Sikri with the Jesuit priests. A few months after the reconciliation, Akbar ordered his son Prince Salim to resume his initial mission and march into Rajputana. That was the thing that had kicked off Salim's rebellion in the first place. Akbar wanted Salim to invade this large Rajput kingdom that covered much of what is the modern Indian state of Rajasthan. The local Hindu ruler of this Rajput kingdom refused to acknowledge Mughal authority, and Akbar wanted to teach him a lesson. Well, Salim dillied and dallied and delayed and kept making excuses of why he couldn't leave for several months, and finally Akbar just got tired of him and just gave up and told Salim to return to Allahabad, which he did in November 1603. Over the next year, there were two important deaths that really changed the relationship between Emperor Akbar the Great and his son, Prince Salim. The first was the death of Akbar's youngest son, Danial. Danial, just like his two older brothers, Murad Mirza and Prince Salim himself, Danial was an alcoholic. And just like his brother Murad, Danial died of alcohol poisoning in May 1604. Back in Allahabad, Prince Salim was preparing this big party to celebrate the reconciliation between him and his father. And now that he was the last remaining son, Prince Salim did not care in the least about upsetting his father. He felt he had nothing to worry about. He was almost guaranteed to succeed his father now. Or so he thought. Now the thing about Prince Salim was that he could be very malicious and very cruel, especially when he got drunk. When Prince Salim got intoxicated, when he got drunk, which he did very often, he would inflict severe penalties on his subjects in Allahabad for the most trivial of offenses. This behavior eventually leaked back to the royal court in Agra, and many people started to get concerned. Akbar also heard about these atrocities in Allahabad, and he began to get concerned that a madman might inherit his empire. Eventually, things got so bad that Akbar decided it was time to march on Allahabad and arrest his son. The only thing that stopped Akbar from doing so was the sudden death of his mother, Hamida Bano. Akbar was just starting to march on Allahabad. He was just preparing his army to go to Allahabad when he learned that his mother was very sick. So Akbar canceled his plans to march on Allahabad and went to Agra to visit his mother. His mother, Hamida Bano, died 5 days later in August 1604. This was just a few months after Akbar's son, Danial, had died. Hamida Bano was 77 years old when she died, and Akbar went into mourning once again. He shaved his mustache, he shaved his head, and he shaved his eyebrows and fasted for several days. Hamida Bano was eventually buried in Delhi next to her husband and Akbar's father, Emperor Humayun. After his mother's death, Akbar ordered Salim to join him in mourning in Agra. And Prince Salim, to his credit, though he was probably worried about the tone of the message from his father, he quickly obeyed. And when Prince Salim arrived in Agra, Akbar greeted him with all the appropriate royal honor and pomp and circumstance and extravagance that would be due to a prince returning home to see his father. But later that day, Akbar took his son Prince Salim into one of the inner apartments of the palace for a private talk. They were alone. Akbar began slapping and cursing his son for his bad behavior. He ordered Salim to get help for his issues, for his drunkenness, for his drug addiction. And there was an implied threat that if Prince Salim didn't shape up, Khusrau would be named his successor instead. Then Akbar had Salim locked into a room with a doctor. Then he cut off Salim's access to alcohol and opium, and then he disbanded Salim's army, and finally he arrested all of Salim's closest supporters. Now after this, Prince Salim seemed to sober up and shape up, and his behavior improved. And seeing this change in his son, Akbar pardoned Prince Salim. But instead of returning to Allahabad, Prince Salim chose to remain in Agra with his father, and he fulfilled all of the required duties expected of him as a Mughal prince. Now, he still drank alcohol and still used opium regularly, but at least he kept it under control. Nonetheless, despite these improvements by Prince Salim, the rivalry between him and his son Prince Khusrau was dividing the royal court, it was dividing the palace, and even dividing their family. The fact is that even though Prince Salim's behavior seemed to have improved, a lot of people just didn't trust him. After all, he had rebelled against his father and had proven to be a malicious and cruel ruler in Allahabad. So there were powerful members of Akbar's royal court who supported Prince Khusrau and wanted Prince Khusrau to succeed his grandfather Akbar. One of these was Raja Man Singh, Akbar's chief of staff and one of his top generals. Coincidentally, or perhaps not so coincidentally, Raja Man Singh was also Prince Khusrau's maternal uncle. Another supporter of Prince Khusrau was Aziz Koka, who was the governor of Gujarat, but also Akbar's foster brother. Now, these two men worked to pull in other supporters, other people to support Prince Khusrau over Prince Salim, and many people did join in, but there were many people, in fact, many more people, who believed the line of succession should remain intact and go from Akbar to Prince Salim. There are also reports that Akbar openly considered naming Khusrau as his successor, and Akbar had to acknowledge that due to his son's rebellion and due to his son's poor behavior in Allahabad, Prince Salim would always have his opponents. But Akbar also knew that if he affirmed Khusrau as his successor, it would almost certainly lead to civil war. Because as soon as he died, Prince Salim would demand his birthright and his supporters would rally around him and the civil war would be on. And the last thing Akbar wanted was for this empire that he had worked so hard to build to be torn apart by civil war. This rivalry between Prince Salim and his son Prince Khusrau also led to the death of Salim's wife, Shah Begum, in May 1605. Shah Begum was so distressed, so emotionally hurt by this deadly rivalry between father and son that she tried to self-medicate by taking opium and accidentally overdosed. However, there are some reports that state that this was no accident and that she deliberately overdosed and committed suicide. Prince Salim was heartbroken by his wife's death, and he fasted for 4 days after she died. Now, just to give you an example of this rivalry, of how contentious and divisive this rivalry was between Prince Salim and Prince Khusrau, Akbar, for some odd reason, organized an elephant fight between the two. He organized an elephant fight between his son, Prince Salim, and his grandson, Prince Khusrau. Well, Salim's elephant wound up winning and defeated Khusrau's elephant, but after the match was over, the men from each prince's camp, Salim and Khusrau, got into an argument and started fighting. Now, Akbar was there. He saw both fights. He witnessed the fight between the elephants as well as the fight between the men. And he saw the potential of the civil war playing out in front of him as the two men and their supporters started to fight each other. Well, Akbar sent his other grandson, Murad, to settle things down, but the very next day, Akbar came down with a sickness that would ultimately kill him. Akbar's sickness was a severe form of dysentery. His doctors provided him with some strong medicine to help stop the diarrhea, but when he took the medicine, it brought on a severe fever and severe stomach pains. This medicine also prevented Akbar from urinating. So when the doctors tried to reduce the medicine, the diarrhea came back with a vengeance. And it got so bad that Akbar was soon passing blood in his stool. And with Akbar dying, the royal palace was just abuzz with plots and intrigue. Raja Man Singh and Aziz Koka had renewed their efforts to try to drum up support for Prince Khusrau over Prince Salim. But when that failed, When they were not able to get enough support for Prince Khusrau, they went to Prince Salim and convinced him to make several promises. Two of these promises are very important. The first thing they wanted from him was his promise that if he became emperor, that when he became emperor, he would not seek revenge on those who had supported Prince Khusrau. Now, this was very important because Rajaman Singh and Aziz Koka and the others who supported Prince Khusrau had to fear for their lives after Akbar died and Salim became emperor. Well, then they might as well throw in with Prince Khusrau right now and take their chances with a civil war. The second thing they wanted from Prince Salim was his promise to protect and uphold Islam in the empire. Even though Rajaman Singh was a Hindu, many people were exhausted with Akbar's extreme views on religion, and they wanted some stability as far as religion was concerned. Well, Prince Salim agreed to both of these demands, and that settled down the plotting that was going on as Akbar was dying. On Akbar's final day of life, he summoned Prince Salim to his room. Throughout nearly a month of sickness, as Akbar was suffering, father and son had barely seen each other. Prince Salim, for his part, was probably afraid that if he met his father face to face during this period, that Akbar would inform him, would let him know that Khusrau would be his successor. But that's not what happened. Akbar motioned for his son to put on the royal robes, put on the royal turban, and to take Humayun's sword. This was a final confirmation that Salim would succeed Akbar as the Mughal emperor. Akbar died on October 15th, 1605. Let's take a look at Akbar's legacy. Our primary concern is whether Akbar died as a Muslim or not. There is lots of disagreement on that. Let's first acknowledge that Akbar was a spiritual person from the very beginning. We saw this with his early commitment to Sufism and his building of Fatehpur Sikri. However, over time, Akbar began to grow disillusioned with the bickering between Muslims of different madhahib, or schools of thought. A school of thought in Sunni Islam very similar to a denomination in Protestant Christianity. However, where there are hundreds of denominations, there's only 4 schools of thought. Now, this disillusionment may have contributed to Akbar leaving Islam. However, he always had a natural curiosity about religion and matters of the spirit. Now, we know that the Hindu influence on Akbar's life led him to almost completely stop eating meat. We also know that he had lengthy conversations and long discussions with the Jesuit priests in Fatehpur Sikri, but there's no evidence that Akbar converted to either Christianity nor Hinduism. Now, we can't ignore the fact that he literally created his own religion. He literally invented a new religion called Deen Ilahi in this weird attempt to combine all religions into one. It is possible that this was just as much a political move as it was a religious one. This may have been an attempt by Akbar to limit the power of the ulama class in the Mughal Empire. Ulama is plural for alim, and it means scholar. Now, people in the West or non-Muslims often say clerics, but that's not the term that Muslims generally use. We use either the word alim or scholar if we're speaking English. And these scholars, or these clerics for you Westerners, they held a lot of power because they were the interpreters of Islam in the Mughal Empire. And this is repeated many times over across many different Muslim empires, kingdoms, and even states, even today. Now, we'll discuss the influence of the ulama class later on in the season, inshallah, when we're covering the reign of Emperor Aurangzeb. In addition to trying to limit the influence of the alim, of the ulama within the Mughal Empire, Akbar may have passed many of these new rules in order to appease his Hindu wives and Hindu allies. Later on, Prince Salim would say that his father did pronounce his shahada on his deathbed, and there are also quotes from Christians who lived during that time who knew Akbar, who stated that he died as a Muslim. In my personal opinion, and Allah knows best, I believe that he was at best an unorthodox Muslim, and Allah knows best. Prince Salim became the emperor of the Mughal Empire on October 24th, 1605 at the age of 36. He took on the imperial name Nuruddin Jahangir, which means light of religion, conqueror of the world. Emperor Jahangir, we're not going to call him Prince Salim anymore. Emperor Jahangir kept his promise not to seek revenge or take any action against those who had supported his son Khusrau. In fact, Emperor Jahangir retained most of the advisors and government officials that had served his father. He appointed Abul Fadl's son to a high position within the army, and perhaps this was an attempt to reconcile for killing Abul Fadl. Ironically, he also gave a hefty reward to Raja Bir Singh Dio, the man who had actually killed Abul Fadl. Another important move by Emperor Jahangir was the appointment of a man named Ghiyas Beg to the office of Diwan. As we mentioned before, the Diwan was the Ministry of Finance for the Mughal Empire. Ghiyas Beg was a relatively minor Persian bureaucrat who had served during the days of Akbar's rule. But we'll see that he plays a very important role in the Mughal Empire, inshallah, but that discussion is for the next episode. Even though Emperor Jahangir was willing to overlook and forgive his opponent's actions, he was not a fool. He did take steps to minimize their power. For instance, one of the most important things was that he kept his son Prince Khusrau by his side in Agra. Khusrau, who was about 18 years old at this time, was essentially a prisoner of his father, even though his prison was a palace. The next move he did was to appoint Raja Man Singh, who was one of Khusrau's primary supporters. Emperor Jahangir appointed him to be the governor of Bengal, which was hundreds of miles away. So that kept those two from having too many interactions. Now let's see how our friends the English were doing around this time. Now England in the late 1500s was not really doing too well. There were some successes, of course. Sir Francis Drake, who was an English privateer, he circumnavigated the earth in 1580. He attacked and plundered Spanish and Portuguese ships, which brought a whole bunch of wealth to the English. And he also helped to repel the Spanish Armada's naval invasion of England in 1588. But otherwise, the English had failed to establish many overseas trading links. But they were well behind the Portuguese and the Dutch, who had already had a strong presence in Asia. So far, England had failed at building a global empire. Roanoke Colony, which was established in 1585 in North America in the modern state of North Carolina, had mysteriously been destroyed by 1590. Also in 1590, Sir James Lancaster, another English privateer, attempted to sail to India by going around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. In addition to most of his men dying from scurvy, James Lancaster was marooned after a terrible cyclone, and he finally made it back to England in 1594. You've heard me use the word privateer twice. The difference between a privateer and a pirate is very simple. If they work for you, they're a privateer. If they work for somebody else or for themselves, they're pirates. Well, the EIC's first overseas trip came in early 1601. We discussed in a previous episode how Queen Elizabeth finally approved the EIC's royal charter. Sir James Lancaster led a fleet of EIC ships out of England in early 1601. They finally reached Aceh in what is now modern Indonesia in June 1602. They returned to London in June 1603, laden down with a bunch of goods from Indonesia. Now, much of these goods had not necessarily been traded for. Instead, they had been plundered from Portuguese ships. However, it was still a successful and profitable journey for the EIC. Now, as far as the EIC's first foray into India, that was a little bit more murky. John Mildenhall was a British adventurer who had been given the responsibility of selling the EIC's goods and wares in Arabia and India. This was an overland journey and not a naval one. Instead of selling the EIC's goods, John Mildenhall ran off with them to Persia to do what he wanted to do with them. The EIC sent two men named Richard Steele and Richard Newman to track Mildenhall down and bring him back to England to justice. They eventually captured him in Persia, but the two men who had been sent to arrest him had a falling out. In a surprising plot twist, one of the men, Richard Newman, teamed up with the fugitive John Mildenhall, and they then traveled on to India. They arrived in Agra in 1603 and even met with Emperor Akbar. However, since they were not there in any official capacity, not much came of this meeting, but it was the first business trip between the EIC or someone related to the EIC and the Mughal Empire. That's going to do it for this episode. In the next episode, we'll discuss Jahangir's war against his own son. We'll also talk about Jahangir's remarkable wife, and we will discuss the Mughals' continued obsession with conquering the Deccan.